You've probably asked this question in the quiet hours, when the analysis stops and something rawer takes over. Why me? Why did this specific person, with this specific pattern of harm, end up in my life at exactly this moment when I was exactly who I was back then? It can feel, especially in the aftermath, like there has to be some larger reason, some cosmic logic explaining why you specifically were the one who ended up here. I want to answer that question honestly today, because the real answer isn't mystical and it isn't random either. It's something more specific and ultimately more useful than either of those explanations. You were reachable in a very particular way at a very particular time for reasons that had nothing to do with destiny and everything to do with a history you didn't choose and patterns you weren't yet able to see clearly. Let's start with the honest premise this entire video is built on, because it matters for how you receive everything that follows. There was no plan, no lesson the universe needed you to learn, no higher purpose being served by what happened to you. What happened to you was harm, plain and simple, caused by a person whose patterns predate you entirely and would have found someone else to land on, if not you. Nothing about that harm was deserved, earned, or secretly meaningful in a way that makes it retroactively okay. I'm saying this clearly at the start because the question, why me, often gets answered in this niche with exactly the kind of spiritual reframing that can quietly slide into something harmful. The idea that you were somehow chosen for this experience, that it happened to teach you something, that the relationship itself was a necessary, meaningful step on your path. That framing, however comforting it sounds, risks suggesting the harm served a purpose, which isn't something I'm willing to tell you because it isn't true, and because it can make it harder, not easier, to fully grieve what actually happened. So if it wasn't fate, what was it? Here's where the real, useful answer lives, and it's worth understanding in careful detail, because unlike a story about destiny, this explanation actually gives you something you can use. Narcissists, as we've discussed throughout this entire series, aren't looking for a specific individual in any deep personal sense when they select a partner. They're looking for a specific set of functional qualities, someone capable of providing consistent admiration, someone patient enough to absorb difficult behavior without leaving quickly, someone whose empathy runs deep enough to extend genuine understanding even in the face of real harm. This isn't romantic destiny. It's closer to a search for compatible function, conducted mostly unconsciously, refined through years of trial and error about what kind of person reliably provides what they need. Here's the crucial piece, though, the one that actually answers your question honestly. You weren't targeted because you were uniquely, cosmically suited to this specific person. You were targeted because you displayed, early on, certain observable qualities that made you a plausible match for what this particular pattern requires. And those qualities, worth understanding clearly, almost always trace back to something specific and identifiable in your own history, not to some inexplicable spiritual assignment. Most people who find themselves in relationships with narcissists share a recognizable set of formative experiences, even though the specific details vary enormously from person to person. Perhaps you grew up in an environment where love felt conditional, available only when you performed a certain way, met certain expectations, or managed someone else's emotional state successfully. Perhaps you learned early that your own needs were less important than keeping the peace, that voicing disagreement carried real risk, that being endlessly understanding and endlessly patient was how you earned safety and belonging in the relationships that mattered most to you as a child. These patterns, learned young, don't disappear simply because you grow up. They become the lens through which adult relationships get evaluated, often completely unconsciously. Someone whose early environment taught her that love requires earning through patience and self-sacrifice will often, without any conscious awareness of why, find herself drawn toward relationships that require exactly that. Not because she's choosing poorly, and not because some cosmic force is steering her there, but because the relational patterns that feel familiar, even when they're painful, tend to feel more recognizable, more navigable than patterns that would actually be healthier but feel foreign precisely because they don't match anything she learned to expect from love early in life. This is the actual, honest answer to why you specifically ended up here, and it's worth sitting with directly. You were reachable because certain real, identifiable experiences in your own history shaped you into someone whose patterns of trust, patience, and self worth happen to align with what this particular kind of harmful dynamic requires in order to take hold. This isn't a flaw in your character, it isn't evidence you did anything wrong. It's simply an accurate, traceable explanation, grounded in real psychology rather than mysticism, for a question that deserves a real answer rather than a comforting story that doesn't actually hold up. Let's go deeper into understanding exactly how these early patterns translate into adult vulnerability, because this is where the real, practical value of this explanation actually lives, not in simply knowing that your history mattered, but in understanding the specific mechanism connecting what you experienced early on to what happened later. So that mechanism becomes something you can actually work with rather than something that remains abstract and unhelpful. The first mechanism worth understanding is what attachment researchers describe as relational familiarity bias, a well-documented psychological tendency for people to feel more comfortable, more at home, in relationships that replicate the emotional patterns of their earliest significant relationships, even when those patterns were painful, inconsistent, or genuinely harmful. This isn't a conscious choice, and it isn't masochism in any sense. Nobody is choosing pain because they enjoy it. It's something closer to a nervous system that's calibrated very early around a specific emotional climate, one that then registers as normal or familiar, while genuinely different, healthier climates register as unfamiliar, sometimes even as vaguely suspicious, precisely because they don't match the template built during childhood. If your early experience of love included inconsistency, warmth followed by withdrawal, affection that had to be earned through specific behavior, a caregiver whose moods you had to monitor and manage, a relationship replicating that same inconsistency can feel, on some unconscious level, more like real love than a relationship offering steady, unconditional warmth, which can paradoxically feel less convincing, even boring, simply because it doesn't match what your nervous system learned to associate with genuine connection. This mechanism explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to understand their own history honestly. Why, even after gaining real insight into narcissistic patterns, does the pull toward familiar dynamics sometimes persist, showing up as a vague dissatisfaction with healthier relationships or an inexplicable draw toward people who display early warning signs your conscious mind clearly recognizes? This isn't a sign you're broken or beyond help. It's simply evidence of exactly the mechanism we're describing. A nervous system that requires deliberate, sustained retraining, not just intellectual understanding, in order to fully update what it recognizes as safe and desirable. The second mechanism worth understanding is what we might call functional role assignment, the specific way early environments teach children a particular relational role that becomes deeply ingrained, well before conscious identity fully forms. If you grew up in an environment where you learned to be the emotional regulator for a parent or caregiver, sensing their moods, managing their reactions, prioritizing their comfort over your own needs, you likely developed a genuine, real skill at this role, one that felt, at the time, like the only available way to maintain safety and connection within that specific family system. This skill doesn't simply disappear in adulthood, it becomes a kind of relational muscle memory, one you're likely to deploy automatically in new relationships, often before you've consciously assessed whether the new relationship actually requires or deserves it. Narcissists, whether consciously or not, tend to recognize this specific skill remarkably quickly, because it's exactly what their own psychology depends on receiving reliably. This is worth understanding honestly. It isn't that you were specifically individually detected and targeted through some sophisticated, deliberate assessment process. It's that the skill you developed entirely reasonably in response to your own early environment happened to be visible enough early in the relationship that it functioned as a strong signal about compatibility. Not because you did anything wrong by having this skill, but because skills built for survival in one environment don't come with a warning label indicating they might also make you vulnerable in a different environment later. Here's the third mechanism, and it's worth understanding specifically because it connects directly to something we've discussed throughout this series: self-worth calibration. If your early experience of love and approval was conditional, available reliably only when you performed certain behaviors, met certain expectations, or successfully avoided causing conflict, you likely developed a sense of self-worth that's, at least partially, externally regulated, dependent on continued approval and validation from important people in your life in order to feel stable. This is worth naming honestly, without shame, because it's an entirely understandable adaptation to a specific kind of early environment, not evidence of some character flaw or deficiency. But this externally regulated self-worth does create a specific vulnerability because it means the withdrawal of approval, a core tool in a narcissist's toolkit, genuinely destabilizes your sense of self in a way it wouldn't for someone whose self-worth developed with a more stable, internally generated foundation. Taken together, these three mechanisms, relational familiarity bias, functional role assignment, and externally calibrated self-worth, provide a genuinely honest, genuinely useful answer to the question you started this video asking. You weren't cosmically placed in this relationship for some hidden purpose. You were, through a completely understandable and entirely non-consensual process of early conditioning, shaped into someone whose specific psychological patterns happen to align with what this specific kind of harmful dynamic requires in order to function successfully. This isn't fate. It's traceable, specific, and, this is the crucial difference, actually changeable, in a way a story about destiny never could be. Here's why this distinction matters so much more than it might initially seem to, and it's worth understanding as we bring this entire discussion to its conclusion. A fate-based explanation, however comforting it sounds in the moment, actually leaves you with nothing to do. If you were cosmically placed in this relationship for some higher purpose, there's no clear action available to you afterward beyond simply accepting that the universe had a plan, which offers a certain kind of comfort, but doesn't actually change anything about your future vulnerability to similar patterns. The honest, mechanism-based explanation we've walked through today offers something genuinely more valuable, even though it's less immediately comforting. It gives you three specific, identifiable places to actually do real work, work that changes your future rather than simply making sense of your past. Let's talk about what that work actually looks like, because understanding the mechanism without understanding how to address it would leave this entire discussion incomplete. Addressing relational familiarity bias requires deliberately, consciously tolerating the discomfort of unfamiliar relational patterns long enough for your nervous system to gradually recalibrate what feels normal. This is genuinely uncomfortable work because it requires staying present in relationships that might initially feel boring, less intense, even slightly suspicious simply because they're healthier than what you learned to expect, resisting the pull to interpret that unfamiliarity as evidence something's wrong, and instead recognizing it correctly as evidence that your nervous system is finally encountering something different from its old template. Addressing functional role assignment requires a specific, ongoing practice of noticing when you're automatically deploying the emotional regulator skill you developed early on, and consciously asking whether the situation actually requires or deserves it. This doesn't mean abandoning genuine empathy or becoming unwilling to support people you care about. It means developing discernment about when that particular skill is being appropriately requested versus when it's simply being triggered automatically out of old habit, regardless of whether the situation actually calls for it or whether the person receiving it has done anything to earn that level of accommodation. Addressing externally calibrated self-worth requires the kind of internal work we've discussed throughout this entire series, deliberately building a sense of your own value that doesn't depend on continuous external confirmation, practiced through the specific, sometimes uncomfortable process of noticing when your self-worth starts to fluctuate based on someone else's approval, and consciously working to separate the two again and again until that separation becomes less effortful and more automatic over time. Here's what I want you to understand as we close out this discussion, because it's the actual, honest answer to the question this entire video was built around. You weren't placed in a narcissist's life by fate, by destiny, or by any hidden cosmic purpose designed to teach you something you needed to learn. You ended up there because of real, traceable, entirely understandable psychological patterns, shaped by experiences you didn't choose, operating in ways you couldn't have consciously recognized until you'd already lived through enough pain to finally see them clearly. This isn't a comforting story about meaning and purpose. It's something better, even though it might not feel that way at first. An honest, useful map of exactly what happened and exactly what's actually within your power to change going forward. This matters enormously for how you carry this understanding forward, because it protects you from two equally unhelpful conclusions people sometimes draw when trying to make sense of why this happened to them. The first unhelpful conclusion is that something is permanently, unfixably wrong with you, that you're simply the type of person these things happen to, destined to keep repeating this pattern indefinitely. The mechanisms we've discussed today directly contradict this. Every pattern we've described was learned, which means every one of them can be unlearned through real, sustained, practical work rather than through some inherent permanent flaw in who you are. The second unhelpful conclusion is the fate-based framing we addressed at the start, that this all happened for a reason, that the universe needed you to learn something, that the harm itself carried hidden meaning, making it somehow acceptable or necessary. I also want to address something that often comes up once people understand this framework clearly, because it's a genuine, fair concern worth answering directly. Does explaining your vulnerability this way put any of the responsibility for what happened back on you? It doesn't. And it's worth being precise about why. Understanding that certain early patterns made you more reachable to this specific kind of harm is not the same as saying you caused it, invited it, or deserved it in any way. A narcissist's choice to exploit vulnerability wherever it comes from remains entirely their own moral failure, not a natural consequence you set in motion by having a history that made you more open, more trusting, or more patient than you perhaps should have been with this particular person. Plenty of people carry similar early histories and never encounter someone willing to exploit them this specifically. The presence of the pattern in you explains why you were reachable. It does not explain, justify, or share the blame for what someone else chose to do with that reachability. This distinction matters because it's entirely possible to hold both truths without contradiction. You can take honest ownership of the patterns that made you vulnerable, doing the real work required to change them, while simultaneously holding the narcissist fully, completely accountable for choosing to exploit what he recognized in you rather than treating it with the care it deserved. Accountability for your own patterns and accountability for someone else's choices are not competing claims requiring you to diminish one in order to hold the other. They can both be entirely true at the same time, and understanding this clearly protects you from the quiet, corrosive slide from honest self-examination into unearned self-blame, a slide this entire series has warned against repeatedly because it's one of the most common ways empaths end up carrying weight that was never actually theirs to hold in the first place.